It's time for the Hockey Minute, your source for all of today's hockey news with some opinion. Strap in for the fastest news in the NHL. This episode is proudly brought to you by fucking nobody. We don't have any sponsors. Now, here's your hosts, Brandon and Ryan.
And here we are. Welcome back to another edition of the Hockey Minute. I am your host, Brandon. With me, as always, my co-host, Ryan. And today we've got a very special interview with Sportsnet's Scott Rintoul, host of the Scott Rintoul Show. But first, please subscribe with whatever podcatcher you use. Leave us a review on iTunes or a voicemail on Anchor if you're fired up about something we said or something you think we should be doing better. We'll play it on the podcast, I promise. All right, before we get into our interview with Scott, let's check in with the dulcet tones of my co-host, Ryan. How you doing, man?
Oh, but I'm doing pretty good. How are you?
I'm good, buddy. Okay, guys, this is a big one for me. Much to the chagrin of my wife, sports radio is almost always on around me. But for as long as I've traveled around and lived away from home, it's always been, kind of a connection to the place that I love and afforded me a small sense of community no matter where I was. That's given me the opportunity to feel like I was growing and learning with the personalities on the air, and that's something that we've really tried to emulate here on this show. There's a whole lot of learning that goes on here. Our guest coming up is a man I've been listening to since 2005. Scott currently hosts the excellent Scott Rintoul Show on Sportsnet 650 in Vancouver and 960 in Calgary. And in an ever-shrinking pool of jobs in the local media market, Scott has managed to carve out a niche as a reasonable voice in a sea of hot takes while somehow straddling the two rival markets, a feat that I don't think should be undersold. So please welcome to the show the former host of BMAC and Rintoul, Scott Rintoul.
What's going on, boys?
Doing real good, real good. That was a hell of an intro, Brandon. Holy, I don't think you've ever said that much about me, and we're like 30 episodes in.
Yeah, that felt like an audition to be my agent as opposed to an intro. That's awesome. I'm good with that.
It's a Tinder profile, man. Jesus.
That's all right. We can just get our producer to clip it for you for whenever you come in the house. We'll play it.
Beautiful. I like it.
All right, so I thought we'd get going with just a little bit of hockey trivia here, just to kind of have a little bit of fun and play with the fact that hockey players are always labeled with kind of having these boring milquetoast quotes. So here we go. I'm going to read a quote and see if either of you boys can get it. We are not going to be fucking suck this year.
Oh. That's a layup.
Yeah, that's Ovechkin.
Yeah.
There you go. There you go.
I thought you said this was going to be tough.
No, I feel like we're going to oscillate here. We're going to play around with it. All right. Like we alluded to in the intro, Scott, you started with the Team 1040 back in 2005 before they became a part of TSN. I'm just wondering if you had any fun stories from the early days of a fledgling radio station, and maybe if you feel there's any comparison between that and your position now with the upstart Sportsnet.
Yeah, it's so different. Back in those days, 1040 had a pretty good run-up to when I joined the party. I was working at Sportsnet Pacific, and actually I was back at Sports Page when 1040, and I was still going to school when 1040 officially launched, and probably like a lot of sports fans in the city was pretty excited that we were getting a sports radio station, and it was new and it was exciting. So
yeah.
That being said, I joined 1040 when it was older than 650 currently is. So that gives you an idea of how long it takes. And I was working in TV, and yeah, there's tons of fun stories. I mean, the personalities that we had at 1040 and some continue to work there. I mean, BMAC, who you mentioned a little bit earlier, that guy is one of the funniest humans I've ever been around. He was a pleasure to work with. And when I first got there, I was doing updates. So yeah. He and Rick Ball were working together, and I didn't have as many responsibilities. So I think it's some of the stuff I did back then that I'm like, I can't believe they kept me employed, but we were having fun. Like, I would come in, I would do my update, and if I felt like those guys were lacking energy at times, I'd get the producer of the morning show to play House of Pain, Jump Around, and I'd get it. So that would be the intro music coming back from break, and I would go in there and I would do the one-man mosh pit, and those guys would be sitting in their chairs, and I would literally be bouncing off the walls, and sometimes I'd run into them, and if you know anything about our statures, those guys are way bigger than me, but I just go smash shoulders with them and just get them smiling and do stuff like that. And they had some great one-liners back in the day as well. You guys are probably too young to know the old Goat Boy sketch on Saturday Night Live, but I would do that one as well. When BMAC always got a kick out of that. I would come in sometimes. We had this big table, and the host would sit on either side of it, and I would just go up. And while they were in the middle of a segment, I would just climb up on that. Dumb stuff like that. But if you've ever been a part of a team in sports, and I'm sure most of the listeners have, you know that just stupid little things like that keep it fun, keep it lively, and create an environment that people want to be a part of.
Yeah, it sounds like a real locker room attitude, right? Like you got to keep the boys light and not take yourself too seriously.
Yeah, well, I think that's any job you work in, that's what people really are looking for. And look, you've got a job to do to be professional, and you have to conduct yourself in a professional manner. But there's some good-natured fun that can occur in any workplace if you have people that have a good attitude and are there to not only work, but to enjoy the environment they work in as well.
While we're on the topic of BMAC, I mean, who's by all accounts one of the nicest people in the business and kind of an elder statesman and a legend in the market. Can you maybe share something that you learned from him that he may have taught you over the years?
Man, so much. I mean, he was the guy who first hired me back in the day at SportsPage when I was still at BCIT. So I learned a lot from him early about how to build stories and what it took to build a good story. And he would give me plaudits as often as he would give me constructive criticism. You know, he was never a guy. This is one of the things I respect about him. In a business that has certain people who are worried about where they sit, he was never a guy who was worried about trying to dispense information to the next up-and-comer and trying to help people get better. He was never fearful that that person would take his job. He was always looking to get the best out of that person who was on his team and looking to help make his own product better by adding good people. So he taught me that. He taught me how to interview well. It's something that I take pride in to this day, and I think is one of my stronger points of what I do now. And I learned a lot of that from working with him in the morning on the morning show. He was always really insightful and thoughtful about the questions that he would ask, and had the knowledge to balance, hey, there are certain questions we need to ask our guest, but let's go beyond that, because generally that's more interesting for people listening to as well, so that they don't get those stock quotes like the ones you guys were referencing coming in. I mean, he taught me a lot about interviewing as well.
Man, that's really interesting. And one of the questions I had for you, because you're obviously well known for doing these kind of level-headed interviews. When you listen back to old tapes of your interviews, are there things that kind of make you cringe and things that you listen to and think, oh, I wish I'd done this or that better?
Every day. Like, it's funny, every day, especially in live radio. It was one of the things that Barry and I agree on, and I think a lot of people who've worked in both TV and radio as well. It was so much easier to execute a clean television show because a bunch of it is scripted. There's a certain amount of time it has to be conducted in, and it was so easy to get the 22 minutes right because of all the different people you had working on it. You do a 3-hour talk show, you're going to misspeak at times. Right. You're going to go a little longer in the intro to a question or mess up a guest's affiliation at some point. You're going to do something every single day that when you finish that radio show, you go, man, I wish I could have done that better. So even here in 2020, I don't even have to go that far back. Like every day I'll finish and go, man, I could have asked that question a little bit better, or I could have been briefer in the way I introduced that, or I wish I would have set this clip up a little better than I did. And I guess the way I would equate it in sports is that in television, when we were doing those programs, it was a lot easier to have a perfect game. And now it's, look, can I go the 9 innings and get the win? Like, there are going to be a few hits along the way, and maybe there's going to be some runs scored, but trying to pitch a perfect game is nearly impossible in the platform we operate.
Oh, I mean, we know that just from doing a 20 to 30 minute episode. I mean, we have episodes that are 2-hour recordings that have to be cut down. So I know where you're coming from here. I wanted to ask you just about just some of the things that you've learned in broadcasting. I mean, you know, you've been around the industry for so long. What are some of the things that you've worked on over the past several years just to improve?
Do you mean specifically as far as broadcasting or just the industry in general?
The industry in general, but yeah, I mean, because I imagine the way that technology has changed and everything as well, there has to be a lot of growth.
Yeah, of course. And that continues to this day. And I think that's something we'll probably hit on over the course of this interview, like where the industry's headed. And I'm not sure anybody knows for sure. But yes, things have changed considerably from when I first started working in radio. And I think the most important thing I've learned is that you have to find your own voice and what you're comfortable with. And there are certain characteristics in other broadcasters that you try to incorporate into your own voice. But if you spend your time trying to be exactly like whoever, Jim Rome, Dan Patrick, Barry McDonald, name your radio show host, like name your guy, you're never going to find your voice, and it's never going to come across as completely authentic. And so for me, trying to find that voice, find what you're comfortable with, it's always part of the journey, because that, just like the technology, it continues to be an evolution over the course of your career. But I think that's one of the things I've learned more than anything. Some of the things I believe from the beginning have held true, that hard work and being a good person to work with, I think, take you further than that word that is so subjective, talent. So if you can do those things, and I think that's true to any industry, but if you can do those things, then you're going to be able to survive in this business where a lot of people aren't able to, and quite honestly, guys, choose not to in some cases.
So one of my questions for you, Scott, is kind of related to the prevalence of hot takes in the sports media industry. And I mean, I think we both understand that's pretty ubiquitous, especially in the ones that have any staying power. I mean, in the local Vancouver market, I think Dave Pratt is pretty well known as being kind of the preeminent hot take artist, even though he's not necessarily on radio right now, but it carried him for years and years. I mean, how do you balance driving engagement with what is basically a form of trolling versus your own version of kind of reasonable analysis?
I think it goes back to the beginning as to the way you view the job. And neither way is wrong or right. It's just what works for you. So there are certain people who view it as a character you play on the radio or a character you play on TV,
yep,
and that it doesn't have to be representative of who you are. And that's Dave Pratt or Stephen A. Smith or whoever on
yep
the radio. And it might not be exactly a parallel to who you are in real life. And I don't want to speak for Dave, but there are a lot of people, and myself included, that when you're using your own name, and maybe this wasn't the right approach, I have no idea, but for me, it's what was comfortable. Look, if I'm using my own name and I'm representing myself, I'm going to give you something that is more authentic as to what I am, what I believe, and the way I view things. And that's why a lot of people, and I know we haven't met in person, but a lot of people will say to me when I meet them, oh, you're pretty similar to the guy here on the radio. Yeah, that's because that's the way I approach the job, because it's my name on it, and that's the way I've always looked at it. And I think part of the other evolution, or maybe even just background for me in coming into this job, is that I do come at it from a place of team sports. And I do come at it from a point of looking at it probably from an athlete's point of view first, before I look at it from a radio point of view. Mm-hmm. So that's probably why I haven't been as much of a hot take guy. I'm a big, like, I'm not a yeller and a screamer. I believe you can have something that is unique and creative that nobody else has thought of or talked about, but it doesn't have to be because it comes blaring at you at 100 decibels.
Hey, you mentioned a minute ago, I feel like we might as well just dive into it. The last decade or so, we've seen so many contractions in the world of traditional media and sports media. Sports media hasn't been spared with the waves of layoffs. Companies like Post Media, Bell, Rogers. It's kind of a two-part question here, but first, how do you see the state of the sports media industry, and then where do you see it headed moving forward?
So there's a couple of things that I believe will always be true, whether it's sports, news, anything. I am a firm believer that great storytelling will be here until the end of time. And it's always been that way. Whether people were sitting around campfires back in the day, or whether they were putting together hieroglyphics, whatever it happens to be, if you can tell a story well, there is interest in that. And I think you guys know that as sports fans, but you know that in whether you read books or whatever your other interests happen to be. There are certain authors and there's certain people who tell stories in such a way that is always going to work. And sports is just a function of that as well. And whether the story is based on the flashpoint of the day or a season or an organization, the ability to tell those stories is always going to work. So where we are today in 2020, I don't know exactly what the future holds, but I believe that is going to be true, that people will always want to listen to people or read people who tell good stories. The platforms are going to change, and that's just a function of technology. Now, I can't tell you everybody's going to listen to sports takes on podcasts for the rest of time, or whether it's going to look slightly different. I think we can all admit that people's work days have changed significantly. It's not 9 to 5. Not everybody does the commute, and yet that's still a big part of life for a lot of people.
Yeah.
So we're kind of in this hybrid mode right now. And look, if you commute via public transit, do you listen to radio in real time? Do you pick up interviews that you heard the night before? I feel like as much as is invested in sports globally, but if we just want to talk about even here in North America, there's always going to be a need for immediate reaction.
Yep.
It's one of the few properties left on the planet that people want to see in real time and they want to experience with their fellow fans, whether it's because they debate against them or they have a similar opinion and they want to share in the touchdown that just got scored or the goal that just got scored. And they also want to have a forum to talk about it right after it happens or the 12 hours after it happens and hear educated voices. Do they feel they need to consume it exactly 12 hours later, or can they hear the same people 18 hours later because that fits their schedule? I think that's part of the bridge that we have to cross. And will you download a daily podcast no matter when it's taped, or will you tune in at a specific time? I think that is probably part of the riddle that is trying to be solved.
And obviously that's a gap that you guys are bridging. I mean, I know that the Scott Rintoul show is always posted, kind of hour by hour as it goes along, and same with all the rival stations. So they're certainly kind of weaving their way into the kind of the newer media market. But I mean, it's just for being on the radio. I mean, I think a lot of us envision a dream job, right? Where you get to show up 5 minutes before you go live. You just talk about sports for 3 hours. But I mean, like we're learning with this show, there's actually a surprising amount of prep that at least should probably go into one interview, and you're doing multiple a day. So, I mean, I know you're working from home right now, but so it's going to be a little bit different. But what does a normal day at the office look like for you?
Yeah, this time I only have to show up like 30 seconds before the show because it's from my basement as opposed to driving in. And like everybody's process is a little bit different. The one thing with doing a morning show, though it's not the early morning show, is that the prep work is somewhat of a split shift. And that's the way it kind of works with sports overall, quite frankly, because when we're in quote unquote normal times, games are being played at night. And, certainly in a market like Vancouver, the one thing that will always be true is you better have watched the Canucks game. Like you better have watched that game because you'll get exposed in a hurry if you haven't. You can have a different opinion on it, but there are people, and you guys know this, that will go, hey, like the second period, the 6 minutes in, there was that shift that Pettersson took, and I know it didn't make the highlight package, but what did you think about what happened in the corner? Well, if you've never seen that, I mean, you're going to get exposed in a hurry, but you guys know the level of passion that exists in a hockey market. It's the same that way in football markets, whatever, when you go down. So you got to watch the game the night before. You also have to pay attention to what's relevant in the sports world. And this is part of where the individual preference comes in. Like, what's an interesting topic? Nobody wants to hear somebody go on the air and just recite stats. That's one of the ways the business has changed a lot. With the internet, information is available to everybody. How do you interpret that information? How do you use that information? That's what's more important. And that's what works. So part of my work's done the night before, sifting around the internet. Part of it's social media. What are fans in a specific market talking about? Did something get put out that's causing a reaction one way or another? And then there's the next morning, being disciplined enough to get up early, see if any news is being made around the country, and specifically doing a solo show. Guys, I have to rely on audio from other people at times. I can't interview for 6 segments a day. My show is broken down into 6 segments overall. I can't do that because we're not just an interview show, but I'm also a solo voice. And you know this. I don't care if you have the most engaging person in the world. At some point, the cadence of their talk, you lose people along the way. So how do I break that up? It's a lot different than on a co-hosted show where you break it up by introducing the other person and hearing from them for a couple of minutes. So I listen to radio in the morning, pop around the country to see what guests are on, to see what might be being talked about, and then try to incorporate that into my show as well so that there's an up-to-date feel to it.
Well, first of all, if you have a guy calling about Pettersson's shift in the second period, that's just Brandon, so you can just hang up. Second thing, you balance hosting a radio show that's both in Vancouver and in Calgary. So, I mean, there's got to be some challenges that come with straddling 2 rival markets and keeping both engaged. Are there any differences in handling those 2 markets, or do they engage with you any differently?
They do, because they're different fan bases, and obviously their team comes first and foremost. What I've been not surprised by, but I've enjoyed over the course of doing the show in the two markets is that we look at the things, at least I've looked at it, okay, what's similar between Calgary and Vancouver or Canadian sports fans in general, as opposed to, hey, what's different? How do I placate the masses? Here's what I knew going in. If I talk about the Flames for 2 hours, I'm going to lose Vancouver. If I talk about the Canucks for 2 hours, I'm going to lose Calgary. So what is relevant to both markets? And the Vegas Golden Knights one day might be relevant to both markets because it's a division rival. It's a team that both are going to have to play perhaps in the next couple of weeks, and they're both trying to track down in the division. So we can talk about the Golden Knights for 5 to 10 minutes if it's relevant to both markets. And there are some times where a Flames topic, and this has been a year where that has been relevant. A Flames topic has been very interesting in Vancouver. Bill Peters and that entire situation, that's relevant wherever you are talking hockey.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter that it germinated in Calgary. Same with the Battle of Alberta and the David Riddick stick flip and hoisting his stick after the show. All of that. Like, that was relevant everywhere. Did you like it? Did you hate it? Should it be done? Is it going to provide fuel for future matchups? Did he screw that up? And so that's a talking point everywhere. And the same sort of thing if Quinn Hughes is involved. Well, hockey fans in Calgary still have an opinion. They might not love the fact the Canucks have what looks like their greatest defenseman that they've ever had in franchise history, but they have an opinion on whether he's the Calder winner or he's better than anybody else is on the blue line, or what problems he might have if these two match up in the playoffs. So to me, it's been more about looking at similarities than it has been about looking at differences, and that's been my approach.
So moving on a little bit to the upcoming playoff format, I mean, what's your opinion on the format? Do you think there's going to be an asterisk attached to this year's Cup? Should it be awarded?
No chance whatsoever. If you're not going to put an asterisk on a 40 season in the mid-90s that led to a Stanley Cups, same thing coming out of the last lockout we saw. There's absolutely no asterisk for me. And I can pretty easily cultivate an argument that tells you it's harder to win this year than it's been in any other year, quite frankly.
Interesting. So Bill Daly's come out and said one positive test for COVID wouldn't necessarily stop the season. What do you think the NHL's threshold for calling the season will be? And do you think that we'll see some players decide either not to return or to step away?
Okay, so two separate things. I don't have a number for you. I have no idea what type of outbreak it would take on a team in a hub city for them to say, sorry, we got to shut this thing down. And I don't think they quite know yet either. They obviously have access to way better doctors, infectious disease experts than any of us do. So those conversations are happening, but I also think a lot of it is watching what's happened with Bundesliga soccer, what's going on in the Korean baseball setup. When there's an outbreak, if there is somebody who tests positive, how are they dealing with it? Has it led to cancellations? What does it mean? I think they're taking in information all the time, and I think the NHL, and I believe this is a smart strategy, has been intentionally vague. They're not going to put a hard and fast number in place while they're still in the information gathering process. I'm sorry, the second part of that question.
Just curious if you think we're going to see some players that decide that the risk is too great before the league does and see the players step away. Or some players step away. Yes,
I do. I think it would be naive to think there aren't players who either have a family situation or are immune compromised for whatever reason that say, I just can't do this in good conscience. Now, if 100% players on the 24 teams involved come back, consider me surprised. But I think there will be players who say, I'm sorry, guys, I want to be there for you, but my family's health, my health. We have a situation in our house. It's irresponsible of me to take part in this. I can't do it. And I think every player will understand.
Yeah, I think Max Domi's already, if it wasn't him, I think it was Mark Bergevin that said Domi wouldn't play at all. I think they've already counted him out. Capo Caco as well. So, I mean, it'll be interesting. We've talked about on the podcast before, just that it wouldn't shock me. I know I'm a Washington Capitals fan. They had already committed to calling up 4 or 5 guys from Hershey just to carry them, but they're probably going to be regulars coming into this playoffs.
Yeah, they very well may be, and that's going to be part of this decision-making process. This is one of the conversations you're going to see unfold over the next little while, depending on what you think a team's chances are of doing anything, playing around, playoffs long-term. Who do you call up? Who do you bring onto that expanded roster? Do you try to get some of your young charges in an organization a chance to see what that level of intensity looks like, the way Cale Makar got thrust in last year? Or do you go, in some cases, let's use the Canucks as an example here. So would you bring Reed Boucher onto your expanded roster? Because while he isn't long-term plan for the Canucks that they think is going to be a guy carrying the team for years to come or an important contributor, can he help them win right now? Can he help them win the play-in round, or can he help them win a playoff round if somebody goes down? And those are the interesting decisions that every organization is going to have to make.
So who are your picks for the finals this year?
It's Tuesday. Throw two teams at me and I'll make a case for them. and I'm serious. I'm not trying to dodge the question, but I think this year is so wild in terms of what could happen that on any day you could convince me of almost anything.
Right.
Because we've had this time off and because we have no idea which factors are going to be the most important coming back, these teams are going to be healthier than we've ever seen them, but we don't know who's really in shape. We don't know who can get out of the gate quickly. And what are we led to believe with the goalies? Okay, do we go with a veteran goalie who's been in the playoffs before? Do we go with a guy who's traditionally started a season well? Do we go with a younger guy because shouldn't have as much rust to shake off? I have no idea. And I'm not trying to avoid the question. I think there are certain teams where you'd go, well, okay, it would be crazy if the Montreal Canadiens, based on the team they have, were able to win the Stanley Cup. Okay, that one might be a bit out there. But for the bulk of the teams involved, I feel like I can talk myself into almost anything on a daily basis.
Well, and that was kind of a follow-up, and I appreciate you may not want to dive into this one too deep either, but do you subscribe to the idea that some people have of some of these teams that, now that it's a 2014 playoff, teams like Montreal and the New York Rangers, for instance, are now in the playoffs, that they can somehow pull it off? Because I've always just kind of felt that if you're a team like St. Louis or Colorado or Dallas that you just ran the league for most of the year, it doesn't really matter who you play. You're probably going to be getting through the first two rounds at least.
Yeah, I don't consider the play-in round a playoffs, and I know that depending on who you talk to, they look at it that way. I will keep it a little bit independent because we've got buys. And the teams that are going to be playing for all the marbles, there's 8 of them already that we know. And now you're just trying to get into that dance. So I do see them as being a little bit separate. And I do think there are teams that are involved in the play-in that are very capable of stringing a run together. But I don't consider it to be a 5th playoff round, if you will.
Okay. So moving on to next season for the regular season for the NHL, I mean, I've seen John Shannon mention that he doesn't believe there will be a season next year unless there can be fans in the seats. And I mean, if that were the case, I'm sure while the NHL could withstand a year off, I'm not so sure about the AHL. Do you think that we could see a contraction in that league?
It's possible. And I don't know the finances of every operation. And the AHL is interesting because there are some parent clubs, most notably places like Toronto and Montreal, that they own their AHL teams. But in most cases, we're talking about independent organizations that sign affiliation deals with certain franchises. We've seen multiple teams that are affiliated with like the Chicago Wolves, for example, over the last number of years. So without getting inside those books and knowing how deep the pockets of those owners are, I think it's really difficult to speculate on whether or not there would be contraction or relocation. But I do fear for leagues that are not at the top level, that don't have billionaire owners. I wonder about the BCHL or the Alberta Junior Hockey League or some of the smaller operations. You look at what's going on with minor league baseball and teams that were going to contract probably, or leagues that were going to contract probably even before the pandemic hit. Well, how does it impact them now?
Right.
I find it hard to believe that unless the health and safety guidelines tell the NHL no chance you can have a season next year, I find it hard to believe that they won't hold one. I mean, they have to show what their product looks like on television. There's another broadcast deal coming up in the States in the next couple of years, and that's a big one. That's a big one for the players. That's a big one. Determines your salary cap. It determines what your revenue structure looks like.
So, Scott, I've been listening to you on the radio for a long time, but by far my strongest memory of your career is your work in Boston in 2013. Can you maybe just walk our listeners through that day for you?
Yeah, it was a bizarre day, I'll tell you that. For those who don't know, I went to Boston in 2013 to run the marathon, and my wife had never made the trip out east before to Boston, so we kind of made it a trip that was going to include running this marathon. That was the genesis of going. So we got there, and hey, the plan is I'll do the Boston Marathon, then we'll go out and celebrate, and a couple days later we'll go to New York and have a great time. Well, obviously we know what happened at the finish line with the bombs going off, but I'm fortunate enough, I guess, in this case, that I was fast enough in completing the Boston Marathon that I wasn't at the finish line when the bombs went off. We were staying in a hotel downtown, but I had finished. I had kind of gotten a little bit of food and nutrition in me, and we'd walked back to our hotel. And quite literally, I had just done an interview on air with 1040 at the time about the race. And we were just, it was very lighthearted. We were laughing about it because that day, a guy who actually is in Vancouver now is Rob Watson. He was leading that race for quite a bit of it. Now, he didn't win, and he finished, I believe, in the top 10 that day. But that was one of the stories that people in Canada were following. And so we joked about that, whoa, that wasn't you out in front of the pack. And we laughed and all this stuff. And we finished that interview, which I had said I would do long before I did the race. And I went to take a shower. And so when the bombs went off at the finish line, I was literally in the shower in a downtown hotel. And I came out and I checked my phone and it was going nuts. And it was all these messages about, are you okay? And a couple of them had come from people I worked with. So I texted back, am I okay? What do you mean? I was just on the air. You guys know I'm okay. And they said, turn on your TV.
Yeah.
So my wife and I turned on the television, and we hadn't heard the bombs explode from our hotel room. And all of a sudden we saw everything unfolding. That was, I don't know how many kilometers or portions of miles away from us. It wasn't that far. But we started to see everything that was happening and the chaos that was ensuing. And then all of a sudden, my phone started to ring. And it was our station back in Vancouver. And it was affiliates around the province. And it was people I had done interviews with in Seattle that somehow found out online that I was running the Boston Marathon. It was national radio stations, TV stations. Can we get you to a studio? Is that possible? All of these sorts of things. And so the next few hours were spent just trying to describe what it was like being in Boston at that time. Were we scared? What were we being told by all of those different things? And so it was a really weird day where you went from being somebody who was just a weekend runner who's trying to complete an event for personal pride to all of a sudden a reporter who wasn't sent there for that purpose. But the training of the job certainly takes over at that point.
What was that like, man? I mean, obviously you must have just been running on fumes and pure adrenaline at that point for doing all those interviews.
Yeah, so while I was doing the interviews, it was, I'm not going to say easy, but it was familiar because I've done that before for big events, and they were sporting events. They were certainly nothing as tragic as what was going on there, but you compartmentalize. You go into work mode, and at times like that, you don't always process all of the emotions you might be feeling because you're broadcasting, and it is different. And it's only after that you hang up that last phone call and that you don't have any more interviews to do. And now I'm talking to my wife, and we're starting to process it. And we go out, if we're trying to find out if we can go out and get a meal because we're both starving at this point, and we're walking. And there's this eerie feel in this city. And I'd run it once before prior to that race. I'd run it like 7 years before. And it's such a celebratory day there where people are all happy and the community supports the event. And it was eerie how quiet the streets were and how nobody was really around, and you could hear sirens every now and then. Wow. So that's when it really started to set in what was going on. And my wife at the time was pregnant with our first child. So there's that part of the equation. And she was, I guess, about 3 or 4 months along at that point. But yeah, all of that starts to sink in, and you start looking at it from a much different vantage point than you do as a broadcaster.
Man, I just, honestly, I can't even imagine. Before we wrap it here, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you just a couple of Canucks questions. Who do you have for the MVP on the season? I mean, I know there's no real wrong answer between Pettersson, Miller, and Markstrom, but I'm just curious what your take is.
JT Miller, for me, was the Canucks' most valuable player this year. And you're right, there's great cases to be made for the others. And I think ultimately the fans will vote for Markstrom, and he might get the lion's share of the vote. JT Miller, to me, had such a profound impact on this team. He outscored any expectation anybody had. Yeah. The impact he had on the likes of Elias Pettersson, Jake Virtanen, and just the way he imposed his will on games. Yeah. And the veteran leadership he showed in big moments, I think helped a lot of those players grow up a little bit this year. So for me, it's JT Miller, but you're right. You can make a case for a couple other guys pretty easily.
Yeah, I'm actually right there with you on Miller. I thought he brought a swagger to the Canucks that was absolutely needed. So in terms of Pettersson, though, do you think Pettersson's going to look at Matthews' $11.5 million as the low bar for his contract?
Hard to know. this pandemic has changed the financial situation so much.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah,
I don't know what a salary cap looks like in a couple of years, let alone next season if they're able to run one. So the landscape's changed considerably. You look at what free agency might be this year, guys, and I said since the beginning, and I think more people are coming around on this, that you're going to see a lot more one-year deals. There's going to be less ability to cash in and less people willing to hand out term. And so I think you're going to see short-term deals for a lot of players who probably would have gotten term beyond that. So I think same sort of deal with Pettersson. Like, you're not looking at signing a long-term contract extension this summer, which isn't, or this fall, I suppose, which is the first point they could talk to him.
Yeah.
He has no idea what it's going to look like. They have no idea what it's going to look like. So I don't know what type of bar he's going to be trying to push.
Yeah, I think that's totally fair. And then finally on the Canucks, what do you make of the Judd Brackett situation? Is it the Canucks fan base making a mountain out of a molehill, or is it another example of the Canucks shedding any dissenting voice?
It's hard to know until we get more information. I mean, You can make the case both ways. It doesn't look good for anybody, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Like, nobody comes out of it looking good just because of the way it played out in the media, where obviously certain sources were talking to certain reporters, and it gets painted pretty quickly as one side against the other. This could have been handled so much more cleanly, and you can blame whoever you want for that. But yeah, it might be, you don't agree with our vision? Well, I guess you're going to have to go ply your trade somewhere else.
Yep.
Or it could be, look, people outgrow positions. People want certain things in their roles, and they get to a point in their career where they're willing to make a leap because they think they can get it somewhere else. This can also work out really well for both sides. I think everybody thinks that one side or the other is going to crumble. But if you're an optimist, who's to say Judd Brackett can't go be extremely successful in another organization? Well, at the same time, some of the people that Judd Brackett helped train and some of the influence that Jim Benning has can't lead to good things in the draft coming up for the Vancouver Canucks.
Well, listen, Scott, man, this has been awesome. Thank you so much for doing this. Is there anywhere that the people can find you or your work?
Yeah, anytime, man. You can always find me online at Scott Rintoul on Twitter, on Instagram, at Scott Rintoul 650. You can find me there. And obviously, sportsnet.ca/50. You can fire up the player or just go to the Sportsnet app and you can hear me Monday to Friday, 9 to 12 live. But the podcast, as you guys mentioned earlier, they're always uploaded.
Beautiful, man. Ryan, why don't you let them know where they can find us?
Yeah, guys, you can always find us on Spotify, Apple, Anchor, Overcast. We got full episodes on YouTube now. And Scott, thanks again, man, for coming on. This was awesome.
Yeah, no problem, guys. Anytime. Thanks for looking me up, and wish you guys all the best with your podcast moving forward.
Oh, appreciate that.
Beautiful. Thanks, everybody, for listening. From Ryan and Brandon, we'll catch you next time on the Hockey Minute.
We'd like to take a second to thank you, the listener, for joining us. And a big thanks goes to our writers and production team, Jules, Mark, and Matt. We couldn't do this without you.
Make sure to follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at The Hockey Minute, as well as leaving voicemails on our Anchor page at Hockey Minute. And always make sure to subscribe to whichever platform you listen to your podcasts.
That's going to do it for us. This is Brandon and Ryan. We'll talk to you next time on the Hockey Minute.